Today we're going to do a brief video on a very serious topic. It's a topic that is close to me. I have a friend who has breast cancer. She's young. She's a few years younger than me. It's a terrible, terrible, tragic thing. And unfortunately in life, we don't usually have an accurate idea of the consequences of the choices that we make. And when it comes to tragedy, of course, something like breast cancer would be on the list. No one wants to point fingers at people and make their burden any heavier than it already is. And this is especially the case because not only do we care an awful lot about these people, but in the individual sense, there's no ability to go back in time, change a few variables, come back and see if specific things would have changed anything. However, as we zoom out to the general population, you can look statistically at cause and effect, or at least get closer to that. And from that, in many situations, we can extract very clear ideas of simple things that can be done and should be done to reduce the amount of suffering in this world. Here's a very clear point. Breast cancer risk increases dramatically for women the later in life they have their first child. And breastfeeding matters a lot too. We're going to get into the details of this. It's a very simple, short presentation, but it's incumbent on us to learn and share facts like this. Because in this world today, we can be misled to believe that because of the abundance of information, that it's easier than ever to make good choices, that people are more informed than ever. Well, they may be informed because, like I said, information is more abundant than ever. But knowledge, and especially wisdom, is increasingly hard to come by. The more abundant the information, the harder it is to get to the truth of things, because there's a lot of misinformation out there. There's a lot of intentional manipulation. And it certainly seems to be the case on this point. And it's so important. It's very important to get out this information. Here's the data. It's from a peer-reviewed publication, but you can get it in more places than just this one publication. It's well known that your risk of breast cancer increases dramatically the later you wait to have your first child. If you're a woman, men can get breast cancer too. That's sort of a different story and much rarer. But here's the shocker. If I blindfolded you and you weren't looking at this slide, and I said, hey, how long can a woman wait to have her first child before there's any significant increase in her risk for breast cancer? You might say, 45, 40. What's the answer? The answer's 30. If she hasn't had her first child by 30, her risk goes up by 50%. Now, it doesn't suddenly hit you the morning you wake up and you're 30. I haven't had a kid yet. Now I have a 50% increased risk. It's gradual. The reference for this is the ladies who have their first child before 20 years old. The lowest risk is before 20. And so that's probably enough said about that. Does that mean that everyone should go out and have their first child before 20? Of course not. There are other factors. This isn't a single factor decision by any means. But breast cancer is a really big deal. And if somebody came to you and they had a crystal ball and they said, hey, you're a little girl, you're 14 or something, and some person comes to you with a crystal ball and says, if you have a baby before you're 23, your first child before you're 23, you will never get breast cancer. And if you wait, you will. Which would you choose? Even with all the other factors, I think it would be rare to find someone who says, breast cancer looks pretty good. It means more to me to do other things in the meantime. I'd rather wait. I'll deal with breast cancer, no big deal. And yet, here's the data, and that's exactly what's happening. And I'll show you the next chart. People are waiting longer and longer to have children, if they have them at all. Larger percentages of women never have children. And the average age for first birth is beyond 31 in the United States right now. It's increasing rapidly. Now, there's obviously an absolute limit as to how late it can go because fertility rates drop significantly after 30. They start dropping before that. Many people who think they're infertile are actually only infertile because they're old. They're too old to be fertile. But sticking to the point, you might ask yourself why both of these graphs are from the UK. And this is the shocker, and we come back to the fact that there are people out there who really don't want you to know this. It's not easy to find this data. It's out there. This is from the National Statistics Office in the UK. It's public data. The US has tons of this data, but you really have to poke around to find it. Why is it so hard to find? Well, because the age at first birth and the rate of breast cancer are extremely coupled. Look at these lines. The chart on the right starts at 95. So that's about here on the chart on the left. If we had data back to the mid-70s, we'd probably see this line continue down. Breast cancer rates go up as first-time mothers get older. It's that simple. Now, and of course this dip is because during COVID, people weren't going in to get mammograms, and so they didn't know that they had breast cancer. Now, moving on to the importance of breastfeeding. This, like vaginal birth, is increasingly treated just as flip a coin, what's more convenient for you? Which are you more comfortable with? And the fact is, it has significant consequences. Now, I won't even address the consequences for the child, which are huge. But just to keep this short, we're talking about breast cancer, right? Just isolating breast cancer. Here's a factoid from this peer-reviewed paper. The risk of breast cancer is reduced by 4.3% for every 12 months of breastfeeding. That's on top of the 7% decrease in risk observed for each birth. So if you went crazy with this, you'd have a negative risk for breast cancer. I'm just joking. The math doesn't work like that, but it's a huge difference. It's a huge difference. And it's not just a difference of when you have your child. It's also a question of how many children you have. Increasingly, the conversation around parenthood, it's not so much, the decisions aren't granular down to how many children you're having. We're treating having children at all the same as having more than one child. Those are dramatically different worlds. Having 3 children is dramatically different than having 2. And again, it's way different for the parents, it's way different for the kids, and it's way different for society. But we're just glomming these things together, which blurs out just how quickly societal tendencies are shifting and how dramatically that's changing. If you wait till 36 to have your first kid, it's way less likely you're going to have more than one versus if you have a kid at 20. You have time to make the decision. Increasingly, you don't have the option. Okay? So there are a bunch of choices that this data should definitely influence in your life. For women, these include the timing and urgency of marriage and children. This idea that you don't even have to worry about it until you're 30 is insane. Given the information that we have, it's insane. Now, I've shown you breast cancer alone is a significant reason to think about this way sooner than 30. And if you happen to be one of the unfortunate people who get breast cancer because you waited, there's no way you're going to think that that was worthwhile. So look at the statistics and let that encourage your urgency. There are many, many other factors, but we're just talking about breast cancer. Another point is whether or not to breastfeed. Again, just like whether or not to give birth vaginally, C-sections are treated as just, well, do you feel like it or not? And there are medical cases where it's necessary, but they're far fewer than the number of people who do it electively. It's really important. And because it's so important, and again, you should research the other pros and cons about breastfeeding as far as how it affects the child. It's enormously important for mother and child to breastfeed if at all possible. It's enormously important. But because it's so important, that also impacts how important it is to find a husband that actually makes decent money. Why? And or it's not just all about, money is not, it's an absolute measure with relative benefit. What I mean by that is you can make other decisions. You can live in different circumstances. You can live in a different state. You could live in a different apartment or house. You could have fewer vehicles or older vehicles or whatever. But the point is that this data should influence all of those perspectives of cost and benefit. So breastfeeding is nearly impossible if you have to go back to work. It can be done, but it's nearly impossible. And when you have a baby is very much subject to when you can afford to have a baby. And so those two things should definitely increase the importance to you of how much money the guy you might marry is making. There are other things to think about. This is just a brief list. For men, obviously this affects the age of the woman you will marry. It also should affect your view of the amount of money you need to earn for the same reasons it affects a woman's view of how much money you earn. Now here's one. As a couple, you will have to make a whole bunch of decisions together. And some of those might not seem as important. Some of those might seem more elective. But the fact is that whether or not your wife breastfeeds, and since I already mentioned it, I will repeat it, and whether or not she gives birth vaginally, you should definitely have a position on that and a preference. And it's definitely within your wheelhouse to make that known. You should encourage your wife to do both of those things, if at all possible, because they have tremendous effect on outcomes. And so I hope that bringing these facts to your attention will help you. And if you're beyond this in life, that you think about what people you might share this with, or at least store it up in your mind so that if you come across someone for whom these decisions are still future, that you can help them understand these points. It literally could save someone's life.